All right, Econ 1A students, I wanted to take this opportunity to go ahead and just review with all of you the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. I looked at the homework and it looked like there were some people who had some questions or some misunderstandings about the nature of long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. So let's take this opportunity to take a look at those and make sure we're 100% comfortable with them going into the final. So the first thing you want to remember is that our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model exists in price level and output space, where output is Y, and that Y is the same Y we looked at when we looked at our measure of GDP, right? It is our total measure of our productivity in our country. Price level up here is the price level. It's how high prices are at any given time. So basically, we can think of it as a measure of inflation, right? So that can be measured by the CPI or the GDP deflator, but the idea is as the price level goes up, the purchasing power of every dollar goes down. We start our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model with aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is downward sloping for three reasons. The first is the wealth effect. As the price level goes up, consumers feel less wealthy and they'll demand fewer goods. So that means that an increase in the price level will tend to decrease consumption, which will lead to a decrease in GDP. There's also the interest rate effect, which says that as the price level goes up, we're going to tend to see interest rates go up. That's going to decrease investment spending and have a negative effect on output. And then the last is the exchange rate effect, which says that as the price level goes up, we're going to tend to see the exchange rate or the US dollar appreciate relative to other currencies, meaning that the US dollar is more expensive. That's going to make US exports more expensive, and that's going to decrease net exports, which will also decrease Y. So all those three factors, the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect, are why we see a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So far, so good? In the long run, aggregate supply is determined by our ability to produce goods and services. And so our long run aggregate supply curve is based on that production function we've talked about. So there's a natural rate of output, Yn, and that is a function of that ability to produce goods and services. So we can think of that as being equivalent to that Y equals A, F, H, K, L, N. And so long run aggregate supply will only move if one of these factors change. So if we have a new technological advancement that makes everything more efficient, if we get a huge investment in human capital that changes our national ability to produce goods and services, if we have a change in physical capital, so much investment that our physical ability to produce goods and services changes, if we have a massive change in our population, either an increase or a decrease, or if we have a massive change in our natural resources. So if you think about maybe if we discovered a huge oil field under Oklahoma or something like that. On the other hand, aggregate demand is going to be shifted by the components of GDP, C plus I plus G plus NX. And that explains why the effect of price level on consumption, investment, and net exports gives us that downward sloping demand curve, right? So far though, that doesn't give us any way to see a period of economic expansion or economic recession. And that gets back to this idea of the business cycle. And what the business cycle says is that there are going to be periods of economic expansion and economic recession, right? The economy is going to grow faster and slower over time. We'll have periods of expansion, periods of recession, but overall, the trend is going to be one of growth. So we're always going to see some level of growth, and that's going to basically be that natural rate of output. And then we'll see deviations from that, right? Little shifts that are, let's see, where did all my orange pens go? Here we have a period where y is less than yn. Here we have a period where y is greater than yn. And those are going to be expansions and recessions. So right now we're in an economic recession. We're going to expect GDP to be below the natural rate of output. And so to get that effect, we need an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And so in the short run, our aggregate supply curve is going to be upward sloping. And that's because of three different theories. It could be sticky wages, it could be sticky prices, or it could be misperceptions. All three theories have the same things in common. A difference between the expected price level and the actual price level is going to give us a difference between the natural rate of output and the current rate of output. So we'll see that right here. So there's our short run aggregate supply curve. I saw on the homework, the last homework 8, a lot of people had a horizontal short run aggregate supply curve. That doesn't work. That says that no matter what the level of GDP is, there's going to be no difference in the price level. And we know that's not true. We know that the price level does fluctuate. It doesn't alter our ability to produce output, but it is going to have an effect on our output in the short run as prices adjust. Input prices, wages, output prices, and the prices of goods and services. So that is our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. We can have a period of economic expansion, right? The economy can grow. We did a bunch of examples of that. We said that there could be incomes boosted in other countries. That's going to increase net exports, shift aggregate demand out, increase our output beyond the natural rate, and raise up prices above the current price level. We could see a increase in domestic incomes. So if domestic incomes went up, you can think about like the early 2000s or the last 10 years, basically, since we recovered from the financial crisis, we saw a period of economic expansion. And so incomes went up, which meant that consumption went up. So an increase in domestic incomes would lead to a shift out of aggregate demand, which is going to give us an increase in Y and an increase in P. It's also going to decrease unemployment. Okay, so those kinds of things. We could see a government policy that creates an incentive to invest would increase I, that would shift aggregate demand out, anything like that. So when you look at a question on the exam that says that something has happened to the economy, figure out first, what is it? Is it something here? Is it C, I, G, or NX? Or is it something else? And then what is the effect of that? So I'm going to give you guys a new example we haven't talked about yet. So let's say that we have, we discover a store of vibranium in California. If you don't know, vibranium is the mythical metal that's used in Marvel comic books. It's in mass, it's lightweight and indestructible, and so it'd be really good, right? That would be really, really cool. If we discovered vibranium mines in the United States, that would be great. That would look like a change in our natural resources, right? That would be an increase in our natural resources, meaning that we have a new input, a new good that we'll be able to use for years to produce goods and services. So that's going to have an effect not on aggregate demand and not on short-run aggregate supply, but that would actually affect change in long-run aggregate supply. And so what that would mean is we would have long-run aggregate supply shift out to some new higher level because of that increase in N. And that would mean we now have a new higher level of our natural output because our production function has changed. Our country's fundamental ability to produce goods and services has changed, right? So that'd be a pretty big deal. So when we're talking about shifting long-run aggregate supply, that's the kind of thing we want to talk about. That's going to mean that our economy is going to grow overall in general. We're going to see a new higher aggregate demand curve based on, sorry, that didn't quite look right, based on our new ability to consume goods and services. Because think about it, if we are now able to produce more goods cheaper and better with new technology, that's going to grow our economy. It's going to increase incomes. It's going to make businesses more profitable. It's going to increase investment spending. It's going to increase government revenue, meaning governments can spend more money. It's going to grow our whole economy. We will see the price level go up. We will see unemployment go down. And overall, it would be a good thing. Does that make sense? Hopefully. If not, let me know. The other thing we could think about is things that would shift short-run aggregate supply. And the book talks about it and the slides talk about it. We haven't talked about it too much, but it's going to be anything that might affect our ability to produce goods and services in the short run. So if I say, unseasonably cold winters damage the crops in the entire Midwest, what would that look like? Well, let's take a look. So we're going to start out with our model and equilibrium, with our long-run aggregate supply here, aggregate demand, and short-run aggregate supply. We're at the natural rate of output and some price level. And then there is a massive winter storm that kills crops in the United States. Or another example would be if oil prices went up. Oil prices going up, it's a short-term phenomenon, right? Oil prices fluctuate a lot, but that makes producing goods and services more expensive. So either of those things is going to be a decrease in our ability to produce goods and services in the short run. So if we say increase, in oil prices, that's a short-term change in our ability to produce goods and services. You can come up here, honey. Sorry, guys. And that's going to shift short-run aggregate supply in. It's going to mean that we go through a temporary recession while those prices are higher, but that our economy will eventually adjust back to where we were, right? We'll see that those the sticky wages and sticky prices are going to have the effect of meaning that people are going to expect prices to be lower than they are. It's going to take some time to adjust. That's going to lead to a decrease in output, but eventually either we'll use fiscal policy or monetary policy to shift aggregate demand up. So let's say we wanted to let's say lower taxes in order to increase consumption spending. That would shift aggregate demand back, and that would get us back to equilibrium. Or we could wait for oil prices to regulate or for farmland to recover from the cold weather and return to our natural rate of output. And that's what that Fear the Boom and the Bust video is talking about, is when something bad happens to the economy, we can try to correct it, or we can know that the economy will correct itself eventually. It's built into it that it has its own self-correcting mechanisms. The only problem is it can take a long time. So that's a review of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Hopefully it helps you have a deeper understanding of what's going on there and what all it entails. If you have any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.